We are live. It's taken us some challenges first on Monday and then this morning, but
Yeah,
well, we're here. We're here, and
48
that's
hours, 15 minutes late, but here we are.
yeah. Well, sorry about that, folks. There's things that there's a third party involved, and maybe even a fourth party. I don't know. One is Mark Zuckerberg and his ilk that has had some bearing
Well,
on our on our broadcast. So, in any case, I can't get into that now. Today, Matt, is going to be a little shorter. We started late, and then we're going to finish a little sooner on account of obligations that that precede us and precede this time. So unfortunately, we can't get into the full discussion of Chapter 25, the general law of capitalist accumulation. And today, of course, we talk about the increased demand for labor. I'm reading the title of the section 1, the increased demand for labor power that accompanies accumulation, the composition of capital remaining the same. I think that this is a really interesting section, really interesting discussion, because it gives us an opportunity to make sense of the apparent boom in different historical moments and our often we experience an incapacity to understand that this is momentary, however long that moment is, that this is a momentary period in different phases of capital accumulation and capitalist or capital centralization. Matt, to get started in this discussion, what I'd like to do is I'd like to share an introduction and then interrupt that introduction by asking you for your thoughts and so on, and then return to what then will be our discussion with interruptions, as it were, for discussion, etc., between us. Between now and I suppose we're going to go till about 10:45, 10:50 or so.
yeah.
All right, perfect. Well, I'd like to begin by sharing a quote, and from this particular chapter, and from this particular section, and it goes like this: the average of capital's investment in a particular branch of production, I've modified the quote here just a little bit. The average of capital's investment in a particular branch of production gives us the composition of the total capital in this branch of production. So I'll present that as a first premise. The average, this is the second premise, the average of these averages in all branches of production gives us the composition of the total social capital of a country. Effectively, this is me speaking now, effectively, and in keeping with the closing statements of the last chapter, social capital is the collective sum of commodity production within the capitalist system, and it is defined by the circumstances of history. There is, however, a deceptive appearance, and this is Marx here. The demand for labor in the subsistence fund of the laborers clearly increase in the same proportion as the capital, and the more rapidly the capital increases. Marx qualifies this with more language, and then I'm going to ask for your thoughts, Matt. The requirements of accumulating capital may exceed the increase of labor power, or the number of laborers. The demand for laborers may exceed the supply, and therefore wages may rise. This must indeed ultimately be the case if the conditions supposed above continue. For since in each year more laborers are employed than in its predecessor, sooner or later a point must be reached at which the requirements of accumulation begin to surpass the customary supply of labor, and therefore a rise of wages takes place. What are we learning here? And I'm interested in your thoughts, not just as far as what we're learning in this particular passage, right? But what might it remind us of things that we've read already? Anyway, I turn it over to you.
What I'm often thinking of is I remember years ago hearing that farm workers in Salinas were better compensated than some of them working in the deeper into the Central Valley,
Yeah.
where there was a better wage scale in Salinas, and I was like, well, trying to figure out why.
Yeah.
And the reason is because they were picking like blueberries or strawberries. They're picking a berry that was very seasonal, and that it had to get done, and the job had to be done quickly, right? And so when we think about capitalists and we talk about the systemization of society, just how how things are placed and when the order of operation that a capitalist operates on, and these kind of like economic laws that exist independent of the will of the capitalist, independent of the will of the laborer, and all these kinds of things. This is a broad study of the way things, generally speaking, work, right? But nothing is guaranteed in life. Nothing in life is absolute and guaranteed. And where, just as we can understand oceanography, we can understand geology, we can make a study of the sea and currents and whatever. You cannot perfectly predict a storm. You cannot perfectly predict what's going to happen with the ocean, right? And you can no more predict exactly what's going to happen if you create a new piece of technology that's going to increase the ability of to produce your commodity, that you're going to have the exact labor force you need, that you're going to have the amount of real estate that you need to create these factories, that you're going to have all these different factors. So Marx is describing is somebody creating a business and it going really well, really fast, and not being able to and not having the amount of workers that they need. So you saw so many economic booms in the United States of America, particularly with the auto industry, right?
Yeah.
So people would come in and they would, and this was actually, I mean, it's really interesting because you have to understand this within the context of America and its history of having internal colonies and of essentially its history of slavery, its history of shackling Africans and placing them, having them as free labor and actually robbing them of humanity and all these things that happened, and then things that later happened with Jim Crow, and then things that later happened with kind of the breaking of the South and having these great migrations up into the northern cities and reshaping the industrial North, right? So all this is going on at the same time as the auto industry is booming. So within that, you have the context for black workers to fight to get into unions, form their own unions, and this is all happening within the context of the growth of the auto industry, which needs workers, which needs to pay workers, which doesn't have time for a lot of these other questions that permeate throughout American society. So within that, you have this vacuum where you have things like personal friends of mine that I know that actually formed organizations like Drum, the Revolution League of Revolutionary Black Workers, all these different things that are going on in Detroit and in Michigan and the auto industry in general, all happened because the auto industry needs workers, period. And so within that creates this whole other vacuum where a lot of things are possible. So it's not just the question of what's possible for the capitalist, also what's possible for the worker. Because as I said, yes, there are the general rules of capital. Yes, we are fighting over a better wage, a better kind of scenario for the worker within the capitalist framework. But when the capitalist needs workers, there are things that are possible that were not possible when they had a much more firm control of the labor coming in and the product going out. When they have less control, that's when wages go up. But it's not just wages going up. It's also when more organization is possible that begins happening. And the other things can happen that don't just change that actually change the way the city as a whole operates. Yeah, it's still within that context. The auto industry at the time was very, very racist and still doing its best to keep black workers out of the unions, to keep
Yeah.
black workers out of the better jobs. But still, they themselves were able to form, their own kind of wings within unions. They themselves were able to form their own revolutionary organizations. They themselves were able to form it. And so we see similar things all throughout the country. I mean, you see like Salt of the Earth is an example of people that, the coal miners, they needed the coal industry needed those coal miners, period. And so they could treat them like really horribly. They could do horrific kind of things. But at the end of the day, when the coal miners could make a demand, they could not just simply be all dismissed. They could not simply be all fired. And so, I mean, the history of coal mining in America is so brutal and bloody and this murderous kind of thing. But the reason it was so murderous and not just like you're fired was because they needed coal miners. They needed men to go down the mine, period. And so they had to either pay them better or shoot them, right? So that's kind of that history.
Well, what you are illustrating with these
point the same thing is the necessity of workers and labor, and not having an abundance of people coming into filling out applications.
Yeah.
Not having the amount of people you need, whether it's you have a small labor pool that want to do the job, or whether you have a giant labor pool that wants to do the job, but there's just a giant pool of labor that need to be done. You're going to run into these same scenarios, and you're going to have to either negotiate or you're going to have to up the brutality. I mean, those are your two options, but that you can't simply dismiss them. You can't say, well, like I got 5 things that need to be done and 10 people that want the job. Fuck you. You're not in that position. Yeah. You're in a very good position.
Yeah. Well, what you're laying out with your historical examples, and certainly what we're learning at the theoretical level in this particular section is the ways in which bottlenecks in the economy, right, require either the exclusion or the corresponding organization of labor, right? And so just as the economy transitions from one phase to a economically more centralized phase, right? There is what I'm thinking about as that the processes that are taking place there are indicative of what I might call the algorithms of dystopia or the algorithms of revolution, right? That things are taking place, right? That will gear society for a downward spiral, or if people take up the task and seize the moment, seize the day, right? And take up the task to seize the day, to take up the task to seize history, right? They can generate and effectively destroy the bottle altogether and create new channels and new systems for interaction and history, new systems of history, new means and new modes of existence in history. In any case, before I return to this particular discussion,
we'll take into consideration 2 large pieces of popular culture, right? So there's one thing you have on the Waterfront. Now, okay, On the Waterfront's made by Elie Kazan. He's doing it to basically essentially cover his ass for having sold everyone at HUAC, but let's leave that aside for now. Mm-hmm. You have all these people, dock workers, clamoring to get some work on the dock, and they're all like, this guy won't do on the checklist, blah, blah. Very similar scenes like the bicycle thief, all these kinds of things where, like, like everybody, this was back in the day when, like, the whole economy was kind of like Home Depot-ish, like people just standing there, like, kind of like, trying to get a job. But that's because there's a lot of work. And then you compare that to something like, years later, there was a series on HBO called The Wire in season 2.
Oh, I remember.
Right, so then the docks. Now it's a very different kind of scenario. There's less work. It's much more hereditary. It's much more, not that system wasn't, but this is much more hereditary. It's much more just like your cousin, your nephew, this. And one of the biggest things that happens in the series that kind of get underplayed. I mean, they're going through all the corruption and all this kind of stuff like that. But one of the things that gets really underplayed is that this guy, he sees a presentation of somebody who's looking to automate the dock workers, the stevedores, right? They have these big machines that'll come in and replace them, and he sees that, and that's like it's like that represents at a level of existential threat that even the mobsters he's dealing with don't, like because like even the mobsters will kill him. These machines threaten to kill the entire
Yeah.
field, our
Yeah.
industry, and so. And so that's the kind of context that we're living in, though. We're living in a different context than what Marx was writing about, wherein like, oh, a new machine will rise and create much more work. I mean, if you look at like the invention of the cotton gin, that created a lot more demand for cotton, a lot more demand for slavery. What that did was it empowered the slave driver, it empowered the cotton industry, it empowered that to overwhelm other industries. This new form of technology and an increase in human suffering was subsequent. Didn't decrease human suffering. It actually increased human suffering because it made the cotton industry that much more powerful. If you look at the Bessemer steel, Bessemer steel gets brought into steel production, and then Carnegie comes up with the double barrel steel, but those two steel making processes that happened around the same time actually made the production of steel much quicker, much simpler, much better, and that became the basis for which all these American cities started rising, all these skyscrapers started coming up, and people dying in molten steel so it was again an increase in human suffering.
Yeah.
So these things that look like, oh my God, this can make life easier, actually make life harder because it empowers the people who make life harder.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what Marx is really describing is the process of these things being introduced in society, which seem like they would lessen the load of the worker, but in fact simply empower the ability of those particular capitalists of that field, of that industry. These particular industrialists are now have an increase in share of power over the whole capitalist system. So let's say capitalism was like a pie chart, and like let's say the steel industry at the time of Carnegie has like a 10% share of the pie. Well, with the introduction of this new technology, he now has a 40% share of the pie, or 30, or whatever the number might be, right? So that increases Carnegie's ability to carry out his plans, and his plans will increase human suffering, not lessen it. It's not lessening the human suffering for the 10% of people that are kind of in his grip. It actually increases his grip to a bigger grip, and that increases the ability of Carnegie to create human suffering while enriching himself.
Yeah, certainly so long as Carnegie is quote unquote at the levers of society, right?
Right.
Certainly that's what happens when he and his folk, he and his ilk, right, are setting the parameters, setting the channels for production in self-serving ways. Absolutely.
Okay, so Jeff Bezos, right? Let's say he comes up with a way to better deliver his product. He comes up with an algorithm to better get Amazon to the front of Google. He figures a way to do something that's going to increase the size of the company Amazon, that in the short run would create a lessening of suffering for the current worker. What that does instead is actually creates the greater power of Jeff Bezos, and the more powerful Jeff Bezos becomes, the more he and his individual corporation can cause human suffering,
Yeah.
and for the workers he has, because the pool of labor will increase. So all these things that seem like they're going to make things better, actually what they do is they would make things better. These just general tools of society would make things better if they were the general tools of society, but because they are privately held, all they do is they increase the power of that private individual, that private entity, and in doing so increase that individual's ability to cause mass destruction in the world. And because their share of power, their share of the pie has increased,
Yeah.
and so therefore their ability to hurt people has increased, because
increased.
all they do, it's a hurting economy. All it does is hurt people.
Well, the thing is that as you're speaking, I'm reminded of an experience that I had when I was a teacher at Lincoln High School back in the early 90s. I was this is the time. This isn't time before I read this stuff. This isn't time before I was considering these things as systematically as I have been over the last few years. In any case, I remember being presented to a teacher whose task was to monitor the computers through which students were learning English. And I thought that at the moment, or at that time, I thought that that was a very interesting and very liberating, ironically, very liberating channel for communication, channel for learning and instruction for students. And of course, I didn't have the understanding at the time to make sense of the ways in which this technology, right? This technology, and I was about to point to my cell phone before it fell out of my hands, that this technology has effectively made its way and been harnessed such that both the communities in which these schools are found and the people that are working in these particular schools have been adversely affected, in relation to the goals and objectives of the people that are introducing and mechanizing and instrumentalizing learning by way of these technologies in the classroom, and now not even in the classroom, right? Instrumentalizing and mechanizing instruction, mechanizing learning in the very homes of people in these communities. Anyway, so that the ways in which technology figures, the way that technology is inserted and facilitates capitalist imposition in time, capitalist impositions in space, adds to the misery and the examples of misery that you just laid out.
Yeah, and every day Elon Musk is coming up with new technologies to just wreak havoc on humanity.
Yeah. Thus may we understand one aspect of Chicano and Chicana labor in the post-war period. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and take us back to earlier years, right? As far as Chicano labor is concerned, Chicana and Chicano labor is concerned in the post-war period. In other words, the Bracero program, employment, and as far as the LA metropolitan region is concerned, I'm thinking now, of course, as I was preparing for today's talk, as I was preparing for the talk that we're doing today, I turned to a couple of books to provide some kind of illustrative examples of the language in this particular section. And I turn in this case to one of the editions that I happen to have of Occupied America, Rudy Acuña's book on the history of Chicanos. And I turn to this particular example here to talk about and to provide some kind of illustration, right? As far as the our apparent, or rather our love and our attraction to what appears to be an economic moment that we are under the illusion that can be recast, that we can obtain it once again if we vote for the right person, right? And of course, I'm making an allusion here, right, to the stalwarts and or rather a critique to the love affair, this torturous love affair with the Democratic Party, right? High hopes, illusions of the sleeping giant. In this short paragraph, Acuña writes, in January of '61, North Americans had high hopes that John Fitzgerald Kennedy would get the country moving again. No group was more optimistic than the Mexican Americans, Acuña writes, who had played an active role in Kennedy's narrow victory in 1960. Officially, the census counted nearly 4 million Mexican Americans. 87% lived in the Southwest and 85% were born in the US. The feeling among many Mexican Americans was that they had enough political potential to influence the political process through the ballot box, and in that way close the gaps causing their socioeconomic and political inequality. Viva Kennedy clubs almost gave JFK a victory in California. They gave him a narrow win in Texas, and along with it, the election. Those organizations gave Mexican Americans the illusion of power and acceptance in the world of gringo politics, writes Rudy Acuña. And then in following up with this, LA, because of its wealth and population, dominated California politics. Although its Mexican population, the largest in the US, developed an awareness of ethnicity during the early 60s, Mexican Americans did not achieve political power. A basic reason was that the Democratic Party purposely allowed the registration of Mexican Americans to lapse. Consequently, Mexican Americans got short shrift. In '63, LA Municipal Court Judge Leopold Sanchez stated that out of 5,000 appointments made by Governor Ed Brown, less than 30 were Chicanos. Brown responded by implying that no qualified Mexican Americans lived in California. And I want to close this particular set of quotes to get your thoughts with the following quote. However, changes were taking place, and this is now in a section called Working Class Chicano Movement. However, changes were taking place by the end of the 70s with a downward shift of the US economy. For example, automakers began to restructure and consolidate production within the country, what you were talking about just a few moments ago, while at the same time building plants abroad. There was unrest among auto workers and others, and a series of wildcat strikes occurred in response to the changing conditions. The recession of '74-'75 caused unemployment to increase, and because Chicanos and minorities had the least seniority, the economic crisis hit them the hardest. Deindustrialization hit almost every heavy industry, leading to the wholesale displacement of Chicano workers and wiping out the gains of the previous 2 decades. So there's a boom, there's an apparent boom, right? And there's a love affair within the context of this apparent boom. And the love affair, of course, is a torturous one, is a love-hate one, if you will, right? And then when the material conditions alter, they correspondingly collapse, right? And our lover, our pseudo-lover, the Democratic Party, for instance, right, leaves us and goes abroad, right?
Yeah.
Recreating the illusions that he created here, in this case, in the LA metropolitan region. Your thoughts?
Well, I think that, when we're talking about whether, it's a couple of different things, but in terms of the love affair for the Democratic Party, I think that oftentimes many of us are far too nice to our compatriots who are contemporaries, who are spouting the party line. We think that, we just need to convince them of this, we don't need to convince them of that. Many of these people, if it's first time exposure to the idea that you can think outside the two-party system, I think that's true. Be very patient and kind with those people. Most people are aware that there is a possibility of being to the left or to the whatever, or to just being outside of both Democrat and Republican Party. So those people that are aware of these things, that will at times accuse you of being, if you criticize Biden, then you must love Trump, or if you criticize Democrats, you must be a QAnon, blah, blah, conspiracy theories. If you do that, then you must be this. Instead of being so kind with these people, so patient with these people, we need to match their energy. And so I match anybody's energy. If you're nice to me, I'm nice to you. If you're not, then I'm not either. And so I think that we need to really start developing that attitude instead of being so kind and being so patient and being so like, I'm here to teach you and I will like slowly pull you along to understand it's not right. No, most of these, it depends on who you're dealing with, but for the most part, these people that will come in and say, if you don't like this, that means this, you need to start smashing them. We all need to start smashing them. And if they want to play a game of public humiliation, they need to be met with that same kind of energy so that other people, third party witnesses, can see that and understand like, oh, I get it. I get it. No, this is not whatever. Because otherwise, if we stand there in silence or we just like abandon it, then it looks like they were right. It looks like that we got exposed and they were right and we were Russians all along, or they were right and we were just secret, like secret Klansmen all along, and they were right and we were really hysterical all along. Like they were right and we were like secretly trying to like pull some wool over their eyes, right? Because that's what it looks like when someone like shouts and goes wherever, and then they and then you abandon the fight. That's what it looks like. So we have to fight, and we have to fight them, and we do have to fight with people who look like us. We do have to fight with people who, in some cases, are our family members. We do have to fight because we're fighting for a clear understanding, and we're fighting for the clear understanding that the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, is the party of capital and is a party of exploitation, and is a party that is one of the major pillars of this society, and it is a party that represents, the white supremacist nature of the system, or the general exploitation of people. That this is what it is. This is part of a colonial imperial history that means you harm, that means to destroy you, that means to destroy everything and everyone in its path. And whatever is true of the general population is even truer of you. It's even truer of you because you are one of the most targeted groups, because you come from this history, this legacy of stolen lives and stolen land. That's what you're a part of. So whatever is true, generally speaking, of the workers, generally speaking of the population, generally speaking about health. I mean, look at all the health indexes. The cancer alleys are worse, the food deserts are worse, the level of exploitation is worse, and the environmental destruction that you're going to be subject to, worse. Everything that is bad about capitalism is even worse for you. So I think that's a really good way of looking at it. So you can avoid all these kind of things of whether, like when talking about, workers who are white and, but they're also exploited. Also, yes, okay, whatever's happening there, it's worse here. Whatever we're talking about there, it's worse here. And that way you can start to think more clearly. Just whatever capitalism is in general, it's worse for you because of this colonial question. And so whatever machinations and general deceptions the Democratic Party has to offer, whatever it is generally true, it's even worse. And so that's kind of what we have to really break away from. And until these people get their mind right, these people I'm talking about, these really vicious, just say anything, bound by no logic, just humanoids out there, they must be hammered and hammered and hammered until they see the light. And that's just my personal opinion. And that's what we have to do. We have to really, really hammer this point, do it unapologetically, do it fiercely, do it strongly, do it intelligently, and it has to get done. And I know it's kind of icky, and I know it's not fun, and I know it kind of sucks, but if we don't do it, and if we don't at least try, then it's just going to look like the people who are saying, give Biden a chance are right, and that we are the ones who are just haters, or we're just losers, or we're jealous of Kamala Harris because like she made it and we didn't. I don't know what that means. Like it's you're gonna look like these ridiculous assholes actually had a point. So like, so we gotta fight.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we've had to cut our program short this morning, and so with your having shared your thoughts and opinions about this stuff at the theoretical and practical level, would you bring some poetic closure, please?
Sure. If 2020 was an election, in case you haven't noticed, the air is toxic, the water is poison, elections are racket, an empty bucket hurled towards a burning house. We call politics, with billions on the line, behind closed doors, lobbyists, politicians, disembodied corporations make the decisions that cage millions, and stage a debate on the Senate floor as though their settled vote had not been cast centuries before. This is some Plymouth shit. Some Dixieland, some wild, wild west. America twists again like it did last Cold War. American intelligence will preemptively blame Chinese or Russian interference for the results of an election when half the population will not vote. Decided by electoral college mean the votes will not count. The American media will blame black people, unarmed black people, for being shot by the police unions. Police unions will blame anyone with a cell phone for recording the incidents. American governors will blame brown workers for a global pandemic, and the American public will blame the rest of the globe for being bombed by America. The 2021 election will start Joe Biden challenging incumbent Donald Trump. Some red states, some blue states, the U.S. Senate, New York real estate, kids in cages, knees on necks, a border wall, a border fence, a bipartisan shot in the legs, a segregationist, a Dixiecrat, a dance with two devils as the country burns to the ground, in case you hadn't fucking noticed.
Okay. Wow. All right. Boom. Hit to the punch. Hit to the punch to the there he is. I'm like
again. Hopefully next Monday. Hopefully we won't be 48 hours and 15 minutes late again. So